In the fall of 1883, a 12-year-old girl named Angel Decora arrived at a train station in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. She had been taken from her family's land in Nebraska 3 weeks earlier. She was Ho-Chunk, a member of a nation that had lived in the Great Lakes region for centuries, that had its own language, its own ceremonies, its own way of marking time and naming children. She did not speak English. She did not know where she was being taken. She knew only that federal officers had arrived at her family's home and that refusing was not an option the law permitted. When she arrived at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the first thing they did was cut her hair. Not as punishment, as procedure. Every child who arrived at Carlisle had their hair cut immediately upon arrival. Hair carried meaning in most Native American cultures. It marked mourning, ceremony, identity, connection to family. Cutting it was not incidental. It was the first act of a systematic process that its founder had described in a speech preserved in the congressional record with unusual directness. His name was Richard Henry Pratt. He was a United States Army captain who had spent years overseeing Native American prisoners of war in Florida. In 1878, he proposed an experiment. Instead of killing or containing Native people, the government should transform them, strip away everything, language, name, clothing, ceremony, memory, and replace it with English, Christianity, and industrial labor. The result, he argued, would be an American. He said it plainly. In 1892, speaking at a convention in Denver, he used the phrase that would follow Carlisle through history: "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Congress funded the school. The Army provided the building. Children arrived from reservations across the country, some sent voluntarily by parents who believed education was survival, some taken by force when parents refused, some so young they did not understand what was happening to them. Angel Decora's hair was cut. Her Ho-Chunk clothing was confiscated and replaced with a uniform. She was given an English name. The school selected it, not her family. Speaking Ho-Chunk was forbidden under threat of punishment that ranged from having soap forced into the mouth to solitary confinement on reduced rations. The school's official records, preserved in the National Archives, document the punishments in the same administrative language used to record laundry counts and meal costs. She stayed for 4 years. She learned to draw. She was talented enough that the school used her work, illustrations for school publications, images that presented Carlisle to the outside world as a place of transformation and opportunity. She left in 1887 and eventually enrolled at art schools in Massachusetts and New York. She became one of the first professionally recognized Native American artists in the United States. She taught at the Hampton Institute. She illustrated books. She designed covers for major publications. And in 1906, she returned to Carlisle, not as a student, as a teacher of Native American art. She spent years teaching at the institution that had taken her language and her hair, creating a Native art program inside a school whose founding purpose was the elimination of Native culture. She died in 1919 during the influenza pandemic at 38 years old. Her story does not resolve. It does not offer a clean narrative of survival or defeat. It offers something harder, the portrait of a person shaped by an institution designed to unmake her, who then shaped that institution in return, and whose life ended before anyone decided what to do with that contradiction. She is not a footnote in the history of Carlisle. She is what Carlisle actually produced when you look past the official photographs of uniformed students and read the actual documents. Now I want to tell you about 3 boys whose names the school recorded and then tried to replace. They were Arapaho. They arrived at Carlisle in 1880 among the first children brought to the school. Their names, given by their families, were Nihu 3U, Little Chief, Bishuhu, Horse, and Nenisenet, Little Plume. The school renamed them. In the admission records, they appear as Lincoln, Grant, and Horace. The names of presidents, the name of a vice president, names chosen from a list applied to children who had no say in the matter, by administrators who understood that what they were doing was deliberate. All 3 died within 2 years of arriving. The school's death records, also preserved in the National Archives, list causes that include tuberculosis and general debility, which was the period's administrative language for a body that had stopped being able to sustain itself. The children who died at Carlisle were buried on the school grounds in a cemetery that the school maintained and that was included on maps of the property. Their families were notified. Sometimes. When notification occurred, it was by letter in English, sent to families who often did not read English, describing children by their school names, not the names their families had given them. Between 1879 and 1918, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School educated approximately 10,000 students from over 140 tribes. The school's own records show that more than 180 students died on its grounds and were buried in its cemetery. Researchers examining the full scope of deaths that occurred during the school's operation, including students who died shortly after returning home, believe the number is significantly higher. The school closed in 1918. The United States Army reclaimed the property. The cemetery remained. The graves remained. The children's names, both the names their families gave them and the names the school assigned, remained in the National Archives in records that were complete, legible, and largely unread for most of the 20th century. In 2017, the Army exhumed 3 graves. The remains of Little Chief Horse and Little Plume, buried under the names Lincoln, Grant, and Horace, were returned to the Northern Arapaho tribe in Wyoming. The tribe received them 137 years after the children had been taken. The ceremony took place on a Wednesday in October. It was not covered by most national news outlets. And then, in 2021, the United States Department of the Interior released a report that documented, for the first time in a single federal document, the full scope of what the federal Indian boarding school system had been. 408 schools, 37 states and territories, at least 53 schools with known burial sites on or near their grounds, over 50 burial sites identified, more than 500 confirmed child deaths in the initial count, with the investigation explicitly noting that the true number was expected to be significantly higher. The last federally operated Indian boarding school closed in 1969. That is not history. That is within the lifetime of people who are alive today. There are survivors of the federal Indian boarding school system who are currently alive, who currently remember having their names taken, who currently remember being beaten for speaking their own language, who currently remember the children who did not come home. The Department of the Interior's 2021 report used the word assimilation to describe the policy. Richard Henry Pratt used a different word. He said, kill. He meant it as a metaphor. The children buried at Carlisle and at 52 other schools demonstrate that the metaphor had a literal dimension that the official language preferred not to name. Angel Decora's grave is in New York. She's not buried at Carlisle. Her Ho-Chunk name, the name her family gave her before she was taken, was Hinuk Mahiwi Kilinaka. It appears in almost none of the histories written about her during her lifetime. It appears in the records now. That is the most the record can do. Restore the name. It cannot restore the language she was beaten for speaking. It cannot restore the 4 years taken from her childhood. It cannot restore the 38 years that were the entirety of her life. The Army is still returning children. As of the writing of this script, the process of identifying, exhuming, and repatriating the remains of children buried at federal Indian boarding schools is ongoing. Families are still waiting. Names are still being matched. Children who died more than a century ago are still being returned to the nations that lost them. This is not something that happened. This is something that is happening. Carlisle was not an experiment. It was a model. Richard Henry Pratt opened the school in 1879. Within a decade, the federal government had decided it worked, not because the children were thriving. The death rates, the runaways, the students who returned to their nations unable to speak their own language and unable to fully function in white American society either, all of that was visible in the records. The government decided it worked because it was cheaper than war and more permanent than a reservation. The Bureau of Indian Affairs began replicating Carlisle across the country. By 1900, there were over 150 off-reservation boarding schools operating under federal authorization. By the time the system reached its peak, 408 schools had operated in 37 states and territories. They were funded by Congress, staffed by federal employees, and authorized by law. The 1891 Indian School Attendance Act gave federal officers the explicit authority to remove children from their families by force if parents refused to surrender them. This was not a regional program or a local aberration. It was national policy, codified in statute, with a budget and a bureaucracy and a legal enforcement mechanism. The children came from every tribe with a reservation: Lakota from South Dakota, Cherokee from Oklahoma, Pueblo from New Mexico, Ojibwe from Minnesota, Nez Perce from Idaho. Children as young as 5. Children taken from families who would not see them again for years, sometimes ever. The schools communicated with parents in English. The schools buried children under English names. The schools sent home bodies when they sent them home at all, without always specifying which child was inside. Zitkala Sa was a Yankton, Dakota girl who arrived at a Quaker missionary school in Indiana in 1884 at the age of 8. She later became a writer and activist, and she wrote about her first days with a precision that the school's administrative records cannot match. She described the sound of scissors behind her. She wrote that she had struggled until her arms were pinned. She wrote that she had cried until she was exhausted, not understanding why the thing that identified her as herself was being removed. She kept writing for the rest of her life. Her essays were published in the Atlantic Monthly. They are still in print. She is one of the few survivors who left a detailed written record. Most did not. Most of the children who passed through the federal Indian boarding school system left no personal account of what happened to them. What survives is the administrative record, the enrollment lists, the punishment ledgers, the death certificates, the correspondence between school superintendents and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the budget requests, and the annual reports sent to Congress. Those documents are in the National Archives. They were always in the National Archives. They sat there for decades while the schools were running, while the schools were closing, and after the schools had closed, complete, organized, and largely unread by anyone in an official capacity. The last federally operated Indian boarding school closed in 1969. The federal government did not commission a formal investigation into what the system had been until 2021. That is 52 years between the end of the policy and the first official accounting of its scope. In those 52 years, the survivors aged. The parents who had their children taken aged faster and died. The grandchildren of the children who never came home grew up without knowing why their families had gaps in them that nobody talked about. In 2021, Deb Haaland was confirmed as the United States Secretary of the Interior. She was the first Native American cabinet secretary in American history. She was Laguna Pueblo. Her own grandparents had been through the federal Indian boarding school system. She knew what she was looking for when she ordered the investigation. She knew because it had happened to her family. The Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative investigative report was released in May 2022. It was the first time the United States federal government had assembled, in a single document, the full scope of what the system had been. The numbers in the report are the numbers that the government's own records produced. 408 schools, 37 states and territories, at least 53 identified burial sites on or near school grounds. More than 500 confirmed child deaths in the initial count. The report explicitly stated that this number was expected to grow substantially as the investigation continued. The investigation is ongoing. A second volume of the report was released in 2024. The process of identifying buried children, matching names to remains, and negotiating repatriation with individual tribes is continuing now. Here is what that process looks like in practice. The Northern Arapaho tribe waited 137 years to receive the remains of Little Chief, Horse, and Little Plume. The identification process required Army researchers to cross-reference Carlisle's burial records with tribal enrollment documents, physical descriptions from admission records, and consultation with tribal historians who held oral traditions about which children had been sent and had not returned. The exhumation was conducted by Army forensic specialists. The repatriation ceremony required coordination between the Army, the Department of the Interior, the Carlisle Barracks Command, and tribal leadership. All of that for 3 children. There are more than 50 burial sites. There are hundreds of identified graves. There are families that have been waiting longer than the Arapaho waited. The federal government's own records contain the names of the children. The records contain the names their families gave them and the names the schools assigned. The records contain the dates they died and, in many cases, the causes. The information exists. The process of acting on it, returning the children, notifying the families, closing the loop that was left open when a child was buried under a stranger's name in a state their family had never visited, that process is what has taken more than a century to begin. In 2023, Secretary Haaland testified before Congress about the ongoing repatriation effort. She described what she called the intergenerational trauma produced by the boarding school system. The ways that the severing of language, name, ceremony, and family connection had propagated forward through generations that never attended the schools. Children who returned could not speak to their grandparents. Parents who lost children to the schools lost the thread of family knowledge those children would have carried. The damage was not contained to the children who attended. It moved through families like a structural injury, visible in every generation that followed. She said these things before Congress in 2023. The congressional record contains her testimony. It contains Pratt's speeches from 1892. The distance between those 2 documents is 131 years of a policy that the government designed, funded, enforced, and then spent 50 years not formally examining. Zitkala Sa died in 1938. She spent her adult life writing about what the schools had done and advocating for Native American citizenship and rights. She is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Her Yankton, Dakota name, the name she was born with, the name that was taken at the school in Indiana, was Gertrude Simmons Bonin. That is the name on her grave. Her Dakota name was Red Bird. It does not appear on any federal document from her lifetime. The children buried at Carlisle and at 52 other schools are being returned to their families now, in the 2nd decade of the 21st century, because a cabinet secretary whose grandparents survived the system ordered an investigation that the government had not ordered in the preceding 52 years. The records were always there. The names were always there. The burial sites were always on the maps. What was not there was someone in authority who had a reason to look. Deb Haaland had a reason. Her family gave it to her. The children are still coming home. The federal government knew where the children were buried. The names were in the National Archives. The burial sites were on the maps. What was missing for 52 years was someone in authority who had a reason to look. Deb Haaland had a reason. Her grandparents survived the system. She became Secretary of the Interior and ordered the investigation the government had not ordered in the preceding half-century. If that sequence, the records existing, the authority existing, the investigation not happening until someone personal was at stake, if that pattern feels familiar to you, subscribe. Because it is the same pattern in every story on this channel, and the children are still coming home.